Chapter 27. Waterloo Station was heaving with crowds starting to head home at the end of a Saturday in London. If Sean had wanted to give Malcolm the slip, now would have been the time. Problem was, he didn't want to. At least, not permanently. But he had to find some time to send Adams a text. Just one simple little text. How hard could it be? Answer: harder than it looked. Malcolm was cutting him no slack at all. Since they'd left Trafalgar Square, there had never been more than about a metre between them. Several times Sean's hand went to the phone in his left pocket. Spook phone in his left pocket, own phone in his right. His fingers brushed the smooth screen, and every time he was aware of Malcolm's unwavering gaze on him. It was 20 minutes until the next Andover train. They lounged by a metal pillar and waited. Without moving his head, Sean could see 4 or 5 people on their mobiles. Wouldn't it be natural to take the spook phone out, start using it? But suppose Malcolm wanted to inspect it, and found exactly one number on it. Thanks, guys, Sean thought bitterly. MI5 had been just too clever. Why couldn't they have just given him the number to put on his own phone, eh? There was only one way he was going to get anything like privacy. "Going for a slash," he announced. He set off without giving Malcolm a chance to object. He didn't look back, but he could tell that Malcolm was following him, all the way over to the gents and down the stairs. He even produced his own 30p for the turnstile. The toilets were hot and crowded and smelled of disinfectant. Sean headed for one of the cubicles. He pushed the door open, stepped in, turned to close the door, and suddenly it was jammed. Malcolm had his hand on the other side. "You said a slash." "I'm a nervous pisser," Sean said. "You going to stand and watch? 'Cause people in public toilets notice when guys do things like that." Malcolm took his hand away. Sean pushed the door shut and locked it. Alone at last, thank God. He had about as long as it takes to have a normal piss. He pulled out the phone, swiped the screen, and... no signal. The toilets were underground, deep enough to cut off electronic signals from the outside. There was nothing he could do about it. Sean flushed and turned towards the door. He hesitated and then unzipped himself. Then he opened the door and zipped himself up again, making sure Malcolm saw the action. He gave his jeans a little tug just to make sure he was in character, and he washed his hands. It was a long, silent train ride. Sean waited 20 minutes into the journey, then stood up. "I need a piss." Malcolm opened his mouth, looked around the crowded carriage, closed it again. But he stood up and followed. Sean had guessed he would. There was a bit more privacy outside the compartment. Malcolm put his face close to Sean's and spoke in a low growl. "You've been once." "Could be, I'm just a little bit nervous." Sean returned his gaze without blinking. Malcolm nodded. "This time you're keeping the door open." "Bollocks I am," Sean exclaimed. He stood back to let a mother with 2 small children push past towards the buffet car. Witnesses, witnesses, lots of lovely witnesses. He let them get a short distance away and lowered his voice. "There's words for old guys who like to sneak a look at young guys' dicks. Do you want me to shout some of them out, real loud?" Malcolm's eyes narrowed, but he considered the point. "If I hear that door lock, I'm knocking it down. If you're still in there when we get to a station, you're knocking it down," Sean agreed. "With you, orders received loud and clear, strength 5. That's Harker, going into the bog and leaving the door unlocked." "Shit." Malcolm put his hand out to block Sean's way. "And I'm taking your phone." They locked eyes. Then Sean shrugged, delved into his right pocket, and pulled out his phone. His phone. The one that didn't have anything on it except general stuff and a little porn in the search history. He silently handed it over, and then took pleasure in shutting the door in Malcolm's face. He called up the one number in the MI5 phone's memory, selected Send Text. "Hit on Monty, 2200 tonight. Don't know how. Send." The message vanished, replaced by a slowly rotating hourglass and the message, "Sending." Sean grinned and watched it spin. Any moment. Sending. Come on, come on, come on. Sending. "Oh, for fuck's sake, send already," he shouted inside his head. Sending. And then he looked at the signal strength. There was half a bar flickering on and off. What totally crap network did MI5 sign their phones up to? Or was it something to do with the train? It'd taken as long as it took to pee. Malcolm would be waiting. Sean groaned and shoved the phone back into his pocket. Then he took it out again. Supposing Malcolm searched him, or just noticed its outline in his pocket. It wasn't a crime to have two phones, but he would have to delete the message from the log. Except that first the message had to fucking send itself. He looked around, desperately seeking inspiration in the narrow confines of an intercity 125 toilet. Finally, he left it behind the door, on top of the towel dispenser, still bravely trying to send its message. He flushed the bog, washed his hands, and opened the door. A train pulled into Andover and disgorged travellers going home for their Saturday evenings, plus Sean and Malcolm. They shuffled their way through the crowd towards the exit in the car park. Malcolm jerked his head, and they made for a white van parked over to one side. He gave the side door a heave. In. Sean climbed in nervously and peered about. The rear windows were tinted and there were none at the side, so the interior was dark. He could make out some cushions. The driver was a man with a shaved head and tree-trunk arms covered in tattoos. He gave Sean a curt nod, then another that was only slightly warmer to Malcolm, who climbed into the passenger seat. The driver gunned the engine and Sean quickly sat down on the cushions as the van lurched into motion. It had been 1800 when the train arrived in Andover. The next 4 hours were the longest of Sean's life, and that was saying something when he thought back to sitting in a police cell waiting to be charged and his time in solitary. From the floor of the van, he couldn't see where they were going, though he tried to follow the route. They stopped at a McDonald's and Malcolm bought burgers and fries for 3. Then they drove off somewhere else to wait. Sean tried to use his senses to work out where the fuck they were. He was pretty certain he could hear the steady rumble of traffic. Were they near the A303? It was a major dual carriageway a couple of miles south of Tidworth, linking London, the M3 and the West Country. There was always traffic on it, but just being near it didn't narrow it down. After 2 hours he heard a car pulling up next to the van and his ears pricked up. The engine sounded very familiar. Of course, the Matiz was an inexplicably popular vehicle, so it could belong to anyone. Malcolm wound his window down. "You late?" Heaton's voice spoke a couple of inches away, heavy with sarcasm. "Yeah, they've actually got security on these things? Crazy or what?" In the back. The side door opened with a rush of metal, and Heaton and Sean stared at each other. The corporal was carrying a large, ribbed plastic box, as thick and high as a suitcase, but twice as long. "Guess I don't need to leave instructions then," he murmured. He dumped the box next to Sean and pulled the door shut again. A moment later, the Matiz drove away. Malcolm turned his head. "The box. Open it." Sean knelt and pulled the box towards him. It was heavy, but nothing he couldn't handle. He reached down and undid 2 simple clips to open the lid. Holy shit. Lying in the box was a Carl Gustav AE-84 RCL recoilless rifle, what a layman would call an RPG. It was like a short drain pipe, painted light green, with a couple of pistol grips and a trigger, the tip of a rocket just poking its snout out at one end. Sean hadn't been trained in its use, but he didn't need to be. He knew his way around a weapon well enough, and bearing in mind that these things were meant to be used against tanks wrapped in steel armour inches thick, he could only imagine what it would do to a brick building. And he had to use it on the Monty, or his mum was... Well, he didn't want to think about that at all. He closed the box again. The driver switched on the radio. After that, the 2 men just sat in the front, waiting. Apparently they were quite prepared to do that for another 2 hours. Sean lay back and stared at the roof of the van. In his mind, that spinning hourglass from the phone was being projected up there. Sending. Had it ever sent? Had MI5 been alerted? Had they had time to do anything about it? Should he have kept the phone on him and tried to send the text later? The sound of a phone going off in the van's grave-like interior was like the opening chord of a heavy rock gig. Sean spasmed into a sitting position. It wasn't just that a phone had gone off. It was his phone. Malcolm calmly pulled it out of his pocket and looked at the screen. Do you usually answer the phone at this time on a Saturday night?" "Huh? What?" Sean demanded. The question was so ordinary that he had difficulty pulling the brain cells together to answer it. Malcolm turned and gazed at him. "It's important that you stick to your usual routine. It's a simple question, yes or no." Then, yeah, I do." Malcolm handed the phone over. "Then answer it." Sean reached out for it, already preemptively running through excuses in his head for why, no, he couldn't come out on the piss right now. It had to be one of the lads. They would have clocked that he wasn't in barracks. His eyes bugged out when he saw the name on the screen. "Mum!" Came out almost like a scream. "Hi, sweetheart." Amazingly, she didn't sound like she was about to burst into tears, which was what usually happened when some crisis made her call him. She sounded almost happy. "I just wanted to thank you for the flowers. They're beautiful." Flowers? "From Sean and all his mates, it says here." There was a few seconds' silence as his mind raced. "So, what are you up to tonight?" she asked, when he still hadn't said anything. "Mum," he struggled to think. The guys were sending flowers? Matt and Copper? Come on. The lads in the platoon, they hardly knew she existed. The only alternative was... His eyes locked with Malcolm's. The phone wasn't on speaker, but it was quiet enough for the tinny voice to fill the van. The men in front had heard every word. "Perhaps you should ask if it says anything else," Malcolm suggested. And because Sean guessed Malcolm wasn't one to make casual chat, he passed it on, dreading what the answer might be. "Oh, hang on, yes, it says, 'World's best mum. We always know where to find you. It's so sweet, love.'" "Yeah," he said harshly. "Gotta go." Oh, right, of course. I didn't want to bother you, just..." He jabbed the screen to end the call. "We always know where to find you." Rich just making his point. He didn't even have to send Malcolm round to do his dirty work. He could send a bomb through the post. Even the guys couldn't protect her against that. "Flowers, you shouldn't have. No, really." He mutely handed the phone back to Malcolm for safekeeping and went back to waiting. The icing on the cake was that by the time 2200 came round, he was bursting for a piss. He hadn't actually been all afternoon. "It's time," said Malcolm. Sean looked at his watch as the van started moving again. 21:53. 5 minutes. Get ready. "Right," Sean replied. He reluctantly lifted the weapon out of the box. He couldn't even fake missing the pub. Once the van stopped, he would have to open the door, fire, and know that the rocket he had just launched was dead on. Anything else wasn't so much inexcusable as just unbelievable. And Rich, Sean now knew, would not take kindly to the unbelievable. The van started to slow. 2 minutes. Put this on. Malcolm handed Sean a black balaclava. Even with everything swirling around his head, he could see it made sense. Someone might catch a glimpse of the guy inside the van, might even recognize him. Sean reluctantly pulled it over his head. The wool was scratchy against his face and it smelled of sweat. Not his. "Stand by." He checked the weapon. Not that there was much to check. A basic trigger mechanism and a flip-up iron sight that did little more than get in the way. He had to do this. He had to trust that the signal had got through, that the phone had finally sent its message, that the spooks had been able to arrange something. He was more in the dark than he had ever been before. He would never have gone into a job with the guys with as little information as this. That was how you screwed up. That was what got you arrested. He would have simply refused until Matt or whoever came up with a plan that actually made sense. But now he was in one place at one moment with one job, and he had to do it. Shit. The van slowed and stopped. Malcolm and the driver both pulled on balaclavas of their own, and suddenly leaped out. A moment later, both the side door and the rear doors were pulled open. Of course, Sean thought. Got to ventilate the exhaust. And there was the Monty, right in front of him. They pulled up just at the entrance to the car park. Malcolm was at the side door. Now! Sean gave himself no time to think, no time to pause. In a smooth move, he had the Carl Gustav on his right shoulder and was staring down it towards the Monty. In the brief seconds between aiming and firing, he noticed the cars outside the pub, the shadows of figures in the windows. Music pulsed faintly from inside. The wind was warm, scented with the remaining heat of the day, and something delicious from the pub restaurant. Sean pulled the trigger.